Ptolemaic royal marriages. The Ptolemaic dynasty ruled Egypt for roughly 300 years, from 305 BC until 30 BC. And for most of that time, they did something that would strike most people today as immediately, viscerally wrong. They married each other. Not cousins, not distant relatives, but brothers and sisters, full siblings, by deliberate theological design. The reasoning was religious rather than merely political. The Ptolemies had adopted the Egyptian tradition of divine kingship, casting themselves as living embodiments of Osiris and Isis, the brother and sister gods whose union sustained the cosmos. To marry outside the family was to break the divine symmetry the whole system depended on. Ptolemy II married his full sister Arsinoe II around 270 BC, and the dynasty repeated this pattern across generations, with the kind of institutional momentum that made each individual marriage feel inevitable rather than chosen. What this meant in practice, on actual wedding nights, was a young woman being brought to the bed of a man who was also her brother, inside a palace where everyone from the priests to the court officials had not only sanctioned this arrangement, but actively celebrated it. The brides were frequently teenagers. The grooms were sometimes significantly older, sometimes already married to other women, sometimes both. The wedding ceremonies themselves were lavish, multi-day affairs with religious ritual layered over political theater. But the intimacy waiting at the end of them was governed entirely by the husband's power, and that husband happened to be the same person who had grown up in the same household. The generational consequences were eventually visible in the dynasty's later rulers, several of whom showed signs that historians and medical researchers have attributed to the compounding effects of inbreeding across many successive generations. Later Ptolemaic kings were described by contemporary sources as unstable, physically unwell, and prone to spectacular cruelty. And at least some of that cruelty was directed at the same women they had married. Several Ptolemaic queens were exiled or murdered by the husband-brother they had wed in a ceremony, explicitly designed to mirror divine love. Cleopatra III was married to her own son, Ptolemy IX, in an arrangement that collapsed into mutual attempts at assassination. The dynasty's marriage structure guaranteed proximity and denied escape. There was no private life separate from the political one, no bedroom that was not also a throne room in miniature. The wedding night, for a Ptolemaic princess, was not a beginning so much as a formal acknowledgement of a cage she had been born into. Mary Queen of Scots and Francis II of France. On the 24th of April, 1558, a 15-year-old Scottish girl, in a white dress, walked into Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris and married the 14-year-old heir to the French throne. The white dress was considered scandalous by some members of the French court, because white was traditionally the French color of mourning. But Mary Stuart wore it anyway, and the crowd that had gathered in the streets of Paris reportedly cheered for her beauty and wept at the spectacle. The ceremony was one of the most magnificent dynastic events of the 16th century. The wedding night that followed it was almost certainly nothing at all. Francis, the Dauphin of France, was by all contemporary accounts a deeply unwell young man. He was small for his age, physically underdeveloped, chronically ill with respiratory problems that had plagued him since childhood, and widely understood by the court physicians attending him to be unlikely to live a long life. Historians have debated for centuries whether the marriage was ever consummated, and the current consensus leans toward almost certainly not that night, and possibly not ever during the 2 years the marriage lasted. What is certain is that Mary was a teenager transplanted into a foreign court, married to a boy who could barely breathe without difficulty, surrounded by French courtiers who viewed her primarily as a diplomatic instrument, and presided over by a formidable mother-in-law, Catherine de' Medici, who had spent decades navigating exactly the kind of court politics that Mary was entirely unprepared for. The gap between the spectacle of the wedding and the reality of the bedchamber was absolute. The candles, the crowds, the gowns, the pageantry of 2 crowns joined, and then a sick boy and a bewildered girl in a room together, with nothing happening and neither of them having the language to explain why. Francis died on the 5th of December, 1560, aged 16, leaving Mary a teenage widow in a country where she held no real power and no real future. She returned to Scotland in 1561 to rule a kingdom she barely knew, haunted by a marriage that had produced nothing except the memory of what a wedding was supposed to look like. Isabella of Valois and Richard II of England. When Richard II of England married Isabella of Valois in October of 1396, she was 6 years old. Some sources give her age as 7, and the exact date of her birth is uncertain enough that historians hedge, but every version of the account agrees that she was a small child, not a young woman, not even an adolescent, but a little girl in ceremonial robes being transported from France to England to be installed as queen of a foreign country. Richard was 29. The marriage was a peace treaty dressed in human form, a diplomatic settlement between England and France that required a royal seal, and Isabella was the seal. Richard himself stipulated, and this was considered honorable by the standards of the time, that she would not be treated as a wife in any physical sense until she came of age. That stipulation is its own kind of horror, not because of what it prevented, but because of what it reveals about the baseline from which it was considered an act of decency. The court apparently required explicit instruction not to treat a 6-year-old as a sexual partner. The instruction was given, the instruction was followed, and then Isabella was separated from her family, her language, her entire world, and installed in English palaces where she was dressed as a queen and treated as a political object, because that is precisely what she was. Richard's later behavior, his increasing erraticism, his paranoia, his political self-destruction that led to his deposition by Henry IV in 1399 and his murder in 1400, has been interpreted by some historians as the unraveling of a man who had genuinely grown attached to a child he was not allowed to touch, which is its own disturbing dimension. After Richard's death, Isabella was returned to France. She married again, a second arranged marriage to a French duke, and she died in childbirth in 1409, somewhere between 19 and 20 years old. She had been a queen of England, a widow, and a dead mother before she reached 21, and it had all begun with a ceremony at Calais when she was too young to understand what was happening to her. Catherine of Aragon and Prince Arthur. The wedding night of Catherine of Aragon and Prince Arthur, which took place in November of 1501, is probably the most consequential single night in the history of the English Reformation, and nobody in the room knew it. Arthur was 15, and had been described by contemporaries as pale, thin, and showing signs of the illness that would kill him within 5 months, most likely sweating sickness or early tuberculosis, though the exact cause of his death has never been definitively established. Catherine was 16, a Spanish princess who had traveled to England to fulfill a betrothal arranged when both children were toddlers. The wedding at St. Paul's Cathedral in London was a national celebration. What followed it was a ceremonial bedding ritual in which attendants, courtiers, and witnesses formally escorted the couple to their chamber, drew the curtains, and left them together, the privacy of the moment being entirely performative given the number of people who had just participated in staging it. The following morning, Arthur reportedly made a remark to his attendants that has been recorded, in various forms, as a boast about having been in Spain the previous night. A crude contemporary expression indicating consummation. Catherine denied, for the rest of her life, that anything had happened. She maintained her virginity at the time of her marriage to Henry VIII in 1509, with a consistency and force that never wavered, not during 8 years of marriage to Henry, not during the years of the annulment proceedings that stretched from 1527 to 1533, not under any pressure the English court or the papacy could bring to bear on her. The entire question of what happened in that bedchamber on a single night in 1501 became the hinge on which the English Reformation turned. Henry's case for annulment rested on Leviticus and the claim that his marriage to his brother's widow was invalid in the eyes of God. If the first marriage had not been consummated, there was no widow in any meaningful sense, and the argument collapsed. Arthur's reported comment survives only in testimony given during the annulment proceedings decades later, by witnesses recalling what a dying teenager had said to them one morning, which is exactly the kind of evidence that historians treat with great caution. Catherine's consistent denial survives in her own words, under conditions of extreme political and personal pressure, which is a different kind of evidence entirely. Whatever the truth of it, 5 months after the wedding Arthur was dead, and a night that 2 teenagers had lived through in a curtained room became one of the most argued over events in English legal and religious history. Anne of Cleves and Henry VIII. Henry VIII agreed to marry Anne of Cleves in 1539, based primarily on a portrait by Hans Holbein the Younger, which depicted her as attractive, serene, and appropriately regal. When Henry rode to Rochester in January of 1540 to surprise her, he was so appalled by what he found that he reportedly tried to leave without identifying himself, and later described the encounter to Thomas Cromwell with the kind of blunt contempt that no diplomatic language could soften. The marriage proceeded anyway because the political alliance with the Protestant German states it represented was too valuable to abandon, and on the 6th of January 1540, Henry VIII married Anne of Cleves at the Palace of Greenwich in a ceremony conducted in a freezing English January. That night, nothing happened. Not a little. Nothing at all. Henry was impotent with her, and he was not shy about explaining why to his physicians in terms that have survived in the historical record. He described her body in clinical, contemptuous detail, her breasts, her belly. What he alleged were physical signs that she was not a virgin, a claim with no basis in any evidence, and which says considerably more about Henry's psychology in the moment than it does about Anne's history. His physician's account of these conversations is one of the more remarkable documents of the Tudor period, a king explaining, at length and with apparent bewilderment, why he had been unable to perform on his wedding night. Anne's ladies-in-waiting reported that she had no idea what had gone wrong or why the marriage wasn't working, and that she required what amounted to a basic education about what a consummated marriage was supposed to involve, which suggests that she too had arrived at her wedding night with very little preparation. The marriage lasted 6 months. Henry had it annulled on the 9th of July 1540. Anne, demonstrating a political intelligence that none of Henry's other wives quite matched in this particular regard, agreed immediately, accepted a generous financial settlement, several properties, and the title of the king's sister, and proceeded to outlive Henry and all 5 of his other wives. She died on the 16th of July 1557, at peace, financially comfortable and free. Thomas Cromwell, who had arranged the match, was executed in the same year the marriage was annulled, partly as a consequence of having gotten it so badly wrong. Anne of Cleves is often described as the lucky one among Henry's wives, and in many respects she was, but her wedding night remains one of the most humiliating documented encounters in the history of royal marriage. A night whose failure echoed outward and destroyed careers, ended a man's life, and left a woman who had done nothing wrong standing in a palace wondering what had just happened. Mary I of England and Philip II of Spain. When Mary I of England married Philip II of Spain at Winchester Cathedral on the 25th of July 1554, she was 37 years old, and he was 27. Mary had waited her entire life for this. She had been declared illegitimate as a child, isolated from her mother, stripped of her title, and subjected to decades of political humiliation. She had finally fought her way onto the English throne in 1553, and now she had the marriage that was supposed to secure everything: a Catholic husband, a Catholic succession, a reversal of everything her father and brother had done to England's faith. Philip had a different view of the situation. His letters to his confidants, written before and during the marriage, described the match in the language of cold diplomatic obligation. He found her physically unappealing. He found England cold and unfamiliar. He understood the marriage as a political necessity and approached it accordingly. Contemporary accounts describe the wedding night as perfunctory, the word itself carrying more weight the longer you sit with it. A man fulfilling a duty. A woman believing herself finally arrived at the life she deserved. Those two experiences happening in the same room, in the same bed, with an absolute gulf between them. Mary became convinced she was pregnant almost immediately. The court prepared. The physicians confirmed. The nursery was made ready. The due date came and passed and nothing happened. And then more time passed and nothing happened. And eventually it became undeniable that there was no child. Mary experienced what historians now describe as a phantom pregnancy, a condition in which psychological and emotional desperation produced every physical symptom of pregnancy without any actual fetus. Some accounts suggest she may have experienced a second phantom pregnancy as well. Philip left England in August of 1555, roughly a year after the wedding, returned briefly in 1557, and then was gone. Mary died on the 17th of November, 1558, believing she had failed at the one thing she had survived everything else to accomplish. She had burned nearly 300 Protestant martyrs in the name of a Catholic restoration that died with her. Her husband had barely been able to endure living in the same country. It had all been set in motion by a wedding night in Winchester that was, from the moment it began, two people experiencing entirely different events. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. On the 16th of May, 1770, a 14-year-old Austrian archduchess named Marie Antoinette married a 15-year-old French prince named Louis Auguste at the Palace of Versailles, and that night, surrounded by the most opulent court in Europe, he went to sleep. Not metaphorically. He wrote in his diary, which has survived, a single word for the date of his wedding night, rien, meaning nothing. Louis XVI did not consummate the marriage that night. He did not consummate it the following night, or the following month, or the following year. The marriage remained unconsummated for 7 years, and during those 7 years it became, by slow and excruciating degrees, a matter of international political crisis. Marie Antoinette's mother, Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, wrote her letters that have been preserved and published, and reading them is an extraordinary experience. A woman of immense political power writing to her teenage daughter in a foreign court, asking, with increasing urgency, for updates on the state of the marriage bed, because the entire diplomatic purpose of the match depended on an heir, and the heir required something that was not happening. Marie Antoinette's responses describe her situation with a mixture of bafflement, embarrassment, and the particular loneliness of a person who cannot explain a problem they do not fully understand. The exact reason for Louis's inability or unwillingness has been debated ever since. The most commonly cited explanation is a physical condition called phimosis, which would have made consummation painful enough to deter a young man who was already shy, private, and deeply uncomfortable with the public performance of his personal life. Some historians believe minor surgery or simply a decision to try more seriously resolved the issue around 1777, and Marie Antoinette wrote to her mother on the same day, with barely contained joy. Their first child was born on the 19th of December, 1778, 8 years after their wedding. The 7 unconsummated years, however, had done their work. The court gossips had filled the silence with rumors. Pamphlets had circulated through Paris suggesting explanations for the failure that ranged from the plausible to the vicious. And many of those pamphlets attacked Marie Antoinette's character rather than Louis's physiology, because that was the direction the culture's contempt naturally flowed. The rumors about her fidelity, her sexuality, and her morality that those years of gossip generated followed her for the rest of her life, and contributed to the dehumanization that made her execution on the 16th of October, 1793, possible. The whole catastrophe had a beginning point, and that beginning point was a wedding night at Versailles when a 15-year-old boy went to sleep. Napoleon Bonaparte and Marie-Louise of Austria. Napoleon Bonaparte divorced Josephine in 1809 because she had not given him an heir, and within months he had arranged a marriage to Marie-Louise, an 18-year-old Austrian archduchess, the daughter of the emperor he had repeatedly defeated in war. Marie-Louise had been raised in a court where Napoleon Bonaparte was, quite literally, used as a figure to frighten children into obedience. The propaganda directed at Austrian aristocrats and their families during the years of French-Austrian conflict had depicted Napoleon as a monster in the most vivid possible terms. Physically grotesque, morally savage, the enemy of civilization. When she was informed she was to marry him, she reportedly wept and told her ladies she would rather die. Then she met him at Compiègne, a few days before the official ceremonies were scheduled to take place. Apparently, the meeting went better than she expected. Napoleon, who was 40 years old to her 18, was by all accounts at his most charming and attentive, and Marie-Louise's subsequent letters to her father describe a cautious, surprised reassessment of the man she had been told to fear. What happened next reflects everything about Napoleon's character in the most concentrated possible form. The civil marriage ceremony took place on the 11th of March, 1810. The religious ceremony was not scheduled until the 2nd of April. Napoleon did not wait. He consummated the marriage the night of the civil ceremony, 3 weeks before the religious rites that were supposed to sanctify it, apparently on the grounds that he had waited long enough and the civil ceremony was sufficient. His confidants recorded his reported comments about the experience with the cheerful crudeness characteristic of his private correspondence. Marie-Louise's own letters from the period are more careful. She describes finding him less frightening than expected, and finding the situation less terrible than she had anticipated, which are the words of a young woman choosing her phrases very deliberately. She was 18 years old, in a foreign country, in bed with a man 40 years old who happened to control most of Europe, and the entire purpose of her presence there was reproductive. She fulfilled that purpose. Napoleon II was born on the 20th of March, 1811. Napoleon was exiled in 1814, and Marie-Louise did not follow him. She returned to Austria, entered a relationship with an Austrian general, and lived until 1847, long outlasting the empire that had consumed her youth. Princess Alexandra of Denmark and King Edward VII. Alexandra of Denmark married the Prince of Wales, the future Edward VII, at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, on the 10th of March, 1863. She was 18, he was 21. The wedding was one of the great public spectacles of the Victorian era, watched by an enormous crowd and celebrated throughout Britain as the union of a beautiful Danish princess and the heir to the greatest empire in the world. What Alexandra either knew or was about to discover was that her husband had, in the months before their wedding, been involved with an actress named Nellie Clifton, that the affair had become known to Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, and that Prince Albert's profound distress at the revelation had contributed to the deterioration of his health in his final weeks. Albert died in December of 1861, and Victoria, in her grief, directed a portion of blame at her son for the rest of her life. Alexandra arrived into a family already fractured by her future husband's behavior, and that behavior did not change after the wedding. Edward VII spent the decades of their marriage conducting affairs with a series of women, some of them conducted with a discretion so thin as to be nearly transparent, and some with almost no pretense of concealment at all. His relationship with Alice Keppel lasted years and was understood by essentially everyone in their social circle. Alexandra responded to this situation with a strategy that historians have found both impressive and heartbreaking. She cultivated a public grace so complete and a private non-acknowledgement so total that she maintained her dignity across 47 years of marriage to a man who was consistently unfaithful. Her private correspondence, in the portions that have been examined by researchers, reveals that the grace cost her considerably more than it appeared to. The disturbing quality of Alexandra's wedding night is not dramatic or violent. It is institutional. She entered a marriage in which the terms had been set before she arrived, in which her beauty and her dignity were required, and her feelings were optional, and in which the wedding ceremony was the most genuine thing that would happen to her in the entire marriage. Edward died on the 6th of May 1910, with Alice Keppel present at his deathbed, brought there at Alexandra's apparent direction, which is either a gesture of extraordinary magnanimity or the final act of a woman who had learned, over half a century, exactly what was expected of her. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.